What feds just found inside Britney Spears' home terrifies entire USA. The hum of black SUVs and the deliberate steps of federal agents broke the calm outside Britney Spears' mansion. The feds weren't here by accident. Something or someone had brought them here, and whatever they were looking for, they believed they'd find it inside. Soon came the sound of tires rolling over private stone, followed by a quiet knock and a badge no one could ignore. This wasn't the Britney Spears the world rallied around during the Free Britney movement. It wasn't the young woman shaved raw by a public breakdown or the pop star swallowed whole by a 13-year conservatorship. This was different. For the first time in a long time, Britney wasn't crying for help. She wasn't fighting for her voice. She was on the receiving end of a federal investigation, and no one seemed to understand why. The agents moved quietly through her home, collecting what they came for. It's still unclear what tipped them off. What piece of information made them believe that something hidden inside that house could matter to them now, in 2025? But they didn't come with questions. They came for answers. And by the time they left, the silence around Britney's name had already begun to erode. The timing of the raid alone raised alarm. It wasn't random, and it wasn't disconnected from what's happening in the wider entertainment world, because almost immediately another name began circulating alongside hers, one far more entangled in controversy right now than at any point in his long curated career: Sean Diddy Combs. Federal agents have been circling him for months, following accusations tied to misconduct, manipulation, and a network of dark hidden power within the industry. Civil suits, allegations of trafficking, reports of blackmail. The surface has only just been scratched, but already names and memories long buried are being pulled from the shadows. And somewhere in that growing web, Britney's name reappeared unexpectedly, and for many, inexplicably. But if you trace the timeline back far enough, the pieces begin to align, specifically to one night in 2007. A night many remember, but few ever understood. The 2007 MTV Video Music Awards. It was supposed to be a comeback. Instead, it became one of the most painful and public unravelings of her career. The performance was disjointed, her eyes hollow. Critics were brutal. The internet mocked her within minutes. It was all chalked up to mental health, to pressure, to exhaustion. But what rarely gets mentioned, what almost never made the front page, was where Britney had been the night before, at a private party hosted by Diddy. What happened at that party has always been a blank space, one of those Hollywood nights whispered about but never fully confronted until now. Because if federal agents were compelled to revisit Britney's life all these years later, and if that visit is in any way tied to the circle surrounding Diddy, it suggests more than a passing connection. It suggests she may have seen something, or held on to something, or perhaps been closer to the truth than she ever let on. And that changes everything. There's something seductive about the idea of a celebrity party. Lights, champagne, laughter echoing off the marble floors of hidden mansions. To outsiders, it's all glitz, spontaneous, and carefree. But those who've lived through them know better. In certain circles, the parties weren't celebrations. They were stages, places where image and control danced tightly together, and where silence was often the price of admission. The night before Britney Spears walked onto the MTV VMA stage in 2007, she stepped into one of those rooms, a private gathering hosted by Sean Diddy Combs, an event now resurfacing not for its guest list, but for its consequences. Britney was supposed to make a triumphant return that year, a comeback performance, a reminder that despite the tabloid chaos, she still had the magic. But according to those close to her at the time, she wasn't ready. She hadn't slept properly. She was anxious. Her confidence was fraying at the edges. Still, the machine around her kept moving. Publicists pushed, stylists prepped, cameras waited, and then there was that party. Accounts from the time suggest it wasn't wild in the traditional sense. It was tight, controlled, exclusive, the kind of room where everyone smiled a little too hard and no one ever pulled out a phone. Not because they forgot, but because they knew better. Britney arrived looking distracted, detached. Some said they were nervous. Others said she barely spoke. What happened between her arrival and her disappearance into the early morning haze remains unaccounted for. The mocked rather than questioned. And now, nearly 20 years later, that oversight feels less like a miss and more like a cover. Because Diddy's parties have since taken on a different meaning. Former partners like Cassie have come forward with lawsuits describing manipulation, coercion, and carefully managed environments where abuse was veiled behind exclusivity. Kim Porter's tragic and sudden death still raises unanswered questions, and those quiet rooms, the ones filled with celebrities and silence, are being revisited under the weight of federal subpoenas. So what does this have to do with Britney? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe she was just a guest, looking for familiarity, for validation, for escape. Or maybe she walked into something darker, a curated space built not for connection, but for power. And maybe the reason she's quiet now is the same reason she never spoke about that night to begin with, because what she witnessed didn't fit the story the world wanted from her. What if her performance wasn't a collapse at all, but a symptom? What if it wasn't the beginning of her downfall, but the first moment the world saw a consequence she was never allowed to explain? When the federal agents walked into her home this year, they didn't just revisit a moment. They cracked open a sealed memory, one that's waited nearly 2 decades to be seen for what it was. And now, the cost of that one night is demanding to be paid in full. For years, Sean Diddy Combs was untouchable, not just a mogul or a hitmaker, but a fixture in the culture, glamorous, powerful, connected. He was the man behind the curtain at award shows, fashion events, and yes, those exclusive parties where the music never stopped and the cameras never rolled. But that image has unraveled, quietly at first, and then all at once. In the past year, multiple lawsuits and federal investigations have begun pulling apart the empire Diddy built. Allegations of trafficking, blackmail, and psychological manipulation have flooded headlines. Women like Cassie have come forward with disturbing accounts of being controlled, surveilled, and silenced. Associates have been questioned, homes raided, properties seized. Behind the designer suits and champagne toasts, investigators allege there was something far more calculated happening, a system built to protect one man's desires, no matter who it consumed. So where does Britney fit into that story? It's a question few were asking until now. The connection Britney shares with Diddy is difficult to ignore. She was present. She was close. And at least once she was at one of those now infamous parties. The night before her most devastating public collapse, she was in Diddy's world. That's not a coincidence. It's proximity. And in a case like this, proximity matters. Because if what's being alleged about Diddy is true, if these gatherings were more than just parties, if they were environments where control was established and influence exploited, then the question becomes not whether Britney was a victim, but whether she saw more than she could ever say out loud. And if she did, what did she do with it? This is where the federal investigation circles back. Authorities don't typically raid a celebrity's home without direction. They follow patterns, timelines, trails. And Britney's trail leads through one of the darkest nights in her career, straight into the orbit of a man now accused of running a machinery of silence and submission. Is it possible she had information, that she kept something, a phone, a file, a recording, that the agents believed could corroborate someone else's account? Or was she simply another name in a long list of individuals who walked through Diddy's doors and never spoke about what they saw? Some say she was fragile at the time, that she wouldn't have understood the full weight of what was happening. But maybe that's the point. Fragility is often what predators count on, and innocence doesn't erase memory. There's also another angle worth noting: the people around Britney. The managers, publicists, stylists, all of them responsible for protecting her brand, but also keeping her in line. Could someone in that circle have been connected to the broader system? Could there have been pressure, not just to perform, but to stay quiet? As investigators dig deeper into Diddy's network, the focus is no longer just on his actions. It's in his reach, how far it extended, who it touched, and who was afraid to tell the truth. Britney may not have been an accomplice. She may not have been a whistleblower, but in a world built on secrets, even those who try to forget can become the key to unlocking everything. When federal agents arrive at a private home, they already know what they're after. Warrants aren't issued out of curiosity. They're built on leads, on patterns, names, dates, and sometimes survivors whose stories need proof. And in the case of Britney Spears, what they were reportedly looking for wasn't just buried trauma or whispered secrets. It was data, connections, fragments of a story that might finally complete someone else's. In recent months, the Diddy investigation has grown more complex and more digital. His accusers have described environments where control extended far beyond the physical, where surveillance was part of the routine, and where phones, videos, and quiet documentation played a role in both intimidation and silence. If that pattern holds true, then it makes sense that investigators are now following the trail into homes that were once considered safe. Homes like Britney's. Sources close to the legal inquiry suggest that agents were looking for digital storage devices, old cell phones, hard drives, laptops, anything that could contain unfiltered windows into that time. And while it's unlikely Britney kept these items for any reason beyond habit or detachment, the very nature of celebrity life back then, constant filming, voicemails, messages exchanged in haste, means there's a chance something survived. But this wasn't just about content, it was about contact. Names, crossed calendars, overlapping timelines. Investigators reportedly hoped to identify who else was in those rooms, who communicated with Britney after that 2007 party, and whether her digital footprint could support the claims of other women now stepping forward against Diddy. Because if the parties were as curated as they seem, if access was managed, if guests were monitored, if messages were exchanged between power players behind the scenes, then even a single recovered file from Britney's home could act as a junction point between stories, a way to show that these events didn't exist in isolation, that there was structure, that there was control. And that's what federal investigations need, not just pain, not just testimony, but patterns. It's not hard to imagine that Britney, in the chaos of her early breakdown, forgot about certain things, devices thrown in drawers, photos never deleted, names she never dared mention again. Fame, after all, isn't just about visibility. It's also about forgetting, pushing away what doesn't fit the narrative, burying what might set off alarms. But federal agents aren't in the business of forgetting. They're trained to dig, to recover. And in a case as wide and reputationally dangerous as this, every recovered bite matters. So when they walked into her home, they weren't just searching for evidence of a crime. They were searching for the moment the silence began, and maybe the quiet trace of those who helped maintain it. In the end, what they found hasn't been made public. Maybe it never will be. But the fact that they believed something was there, that alone speaks volumes. Because in cases like this, silence doesn't mean nothing happened. It often means someone's still holding on to what the world wasn't ready to see. When Britney Spears stepped onto the VMA stage in 2007, the cameras were already pointed like weapons. The music industry had promoted her performance as a comeback, a chance to reclaim the spotlight. But by the time the opening chords hit and Britney stood blinking in the glare, it was clear something was wrong. And before she could even finish the song, the world had already decided what it had witnessed. Headlines the next morning didn't ask what had gone wrong. They ridiculed her body, her timing, her presence. Talk show hosts turned her into punchlines. Gossip blogs used words like meltdown, washed up, and pathetic. Paparazzi stalked her more aggressively than ever, as if suffering somehow made her more available for consumption. And in all of it, no one asked the obvious. What had happened the night before? The media didn't want nuance. They wanted spectacle. And Britney gave them just enough visual evidence to sell it. But what the headlines missed, or chose to ignore, was that her collapse may have begun in a private room the public never saw. At a party she never invited the cameras into, surrounded by people more powerful, more guarded, and possibly more dangerous than anyone realized at the time. That story, whatever it was, never made the front page. Instead, we were told she was unstable. We accepted that she was reckless. We never considered that she might have been overwhelmed, or worse, exposed to something she couldn't speak about. And the media's failure to even raise those questions became part of the damage, because by turning Britney into a symbol of chaos, they obscured the truth that chaos often has a cause, that women in the industry don't unravel in public for no reason, that there are rooms and names and nights that never get mentioned but shape everything. And now, as investigations pull back the curtain on those very rooms, the media is left scrambling. The outlets that profited from her pain now report on Diddy's lawsuits with sanitized curiosity, as if they weren't part of the same machine that once silenced every woman who tried to speak. Because if Britney did see something back then, if she carried a memory or a moment that haunted her for years, the press didn't just fail to protect her, they buried her under a narrative that made it impossible to ever speak the truth. And in doing so, they didn't just hide a story. They protected the people who made it dangerous to tell. Stories don't always end with a confession. Sometimes they end with a whisper, a disappearance, a breakdown no one wants to explain. And when that happens often enough, when the same shadows seem to follow different women down different paths, the question stops being if there's a pattern. The question becomes, why didn't we notice it sooner? Cassie, Kim Porter, Britney Spears, Wendy Williams, Jennifer Lopez, different timelines, different careers, but each of these women, in one way or another, passed through the orbit of Sean Diddy Combs. And each of them, at some pivotal moment, began to unravel publicly, mysteriously, or permanently. Cassie's silence was the first clue we ignored. For years, she vanished without protest. No tell-all, no closure, just absence. Then, in 2023, her lawsuit revealed the cost of that silence, alleging years of manipulation, abuse, and psychological warfare behind closed doors. Her voice came late, but it came. Kim Porter never got that chance. Her death in 2018 was ruled as pneumonia, but even now, her name lingers like an unfinished sentence. According to friends, she had been preparing to speak, to share, and then suddenly, she was gone. The timing never sat right with those closest to her, not because of conspiracy, because of context. And Britney? She became the spectacle, the warning. Her breakdown was broadcast live in 2007, her every step dissected and replayed as entertainment. But the night before her collapse, she was in a room hosted by Diddy. That moment, so quiet at the time, is now a blaring siren in hindsight. What if her public unraveling wasn't madness, but fallout? Then there's Wendy Williams. For years, she stood on her stage, throwing names into the fire, including Diddy's. She hinted, joked, and raised questions others were too afraid to ask. But eventually, even her voice faded. Struggles with health, rumors of mental decline, a court-ordered guardianship, and now, a silence that feels more permanent than voluntary. And what about Jennifer Lopez? She walked away early, detached, moved on, but her silence is striking too. Despite her proximity to Diddy during his first major scandal, the club shooting in 1999, she's never truly addressed that time. No anger, no reflection, just omission. For someone known for reclaiming her narrative, her silence about him remains one of the few chapters she's left closed. What ties these women together isn't just who they knew, it's what they lost. Some lost their voice, some lost their safety, some lost their lives, but all, at some point, fell into a pattern of visibility followed by collapse, of power followed by retreat, and in almost every case, that retreat came after standing too close to the same man. That doesn't make them co-conspirators. It doesn't make them naive. It makes them survivors of an industry that's only now being seen for what it truly is, a machine that builds silence, not protection. And the most haunting part? The stories were always there. The breakdowns, the disappearances, the strange timing. We watched it all happen in headlines, on screens, through statements and scandals, and we never asked the one question that might have changed everything. Who else was in the room when these women started to disappear? For nearly 2 decades, Britney Spears was defined by what the world took from her: her agency, her children, her privacy, and at times, her voice. The spotlight never left, but the power behind it wasn't hers. It belonged to handlers, courts, paparazzi, and yes, sometimes the very people she once stood beside at private parties that were never supposed to be remembered. But now, after years of silence, years of being spoken for instead of speaking, the silence is cracking. Not because Britney chose to break it, but because someone else finally knocked hard enough to shake it loose. The federal agents who entered her home didn't just come for objects. They came for history, for fragments of a night most people forgot. But that may now matter more than anyone ever imagined. Whether Britney held on to what they were looking for out of fear, trauma, or simple forgetfulness, we may never know. What's clear is this: The world that once surrounded her is no longer protected by wealth and reputation alone. And Britney may no longer be standing at the edge of that world. She may be standing in the middle of it. This doesn't make her guilty. It doesn't make her a savior either. It makes her human, a woman who has been through the machine and comes out the other side. Scarred, yes, but still standing. The question now isn't just what happens to Diddy or what the federal case will uncover in time. The question is, what will Britney do with her voice now that people are finally willing to listen? Because if what's been found in her home leads to more names, more truths, more survivors finding their way out of the dark, then maybe, just maybe, her silence was never the end of the story. Maybe it was the beginning of someone else's. So we ask you, what do you think Britney's role really was in all of this? Do you believe she knows more than she's ever let on? And if she speaks, who else might fall? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth breakdowns and behind-the-scenes truths they don't want you to hear.